Rawr!
If you're one of the world's 2.2 billion Christians, wow, that's a lot of people. You probably think that around 2,000 years ago, here in the Nazareth Mountains in the Galilee region of modern Israel, a man known as Jesus Christ was born. You probably think of him as the Messiah, the Son of Yahweh, the God of the Jews. But if you're one of the other 5 billion people on the planet, you probably just think of Jesus as some kind of wise man who had a religious cult built up around him after his death. Or maybe you're one of those people who believe he never even really existed. He's just some kind of literary myth like a Hercules or King Arthur. But whichever camp you're in, I think we can all agree that Jesus is one of the most influential and intriguing figures in all of world history. About 40 years ago, when I was a good little Catholic boy going to Sunday school, I was taught the story of Jesus. It went something like this.
About 2,000 years ago, a young married woman, still a virgin, was made pregnant by the God of the Jews. She gave birth to a baby in a barn, and 3 wise men found him by following a star, so they could worship him and give some gold and scented oils. When he grew up, Jesus walked around Judea telling thousands of people he was God and performing miracles, such as magically making fish and bread appear, turning water into wine, and raising people from the dead. One night, he told his friends to eat some bread, which was his flesh, and drink some wine, which was his blood. Then the Jewish authorities, who were angry with him, turned him over to the Romans, who actually wanted to let him go. But the Jews convinced them to crucify him. But then, a few days later, he rose from the dead and told his friends that dying was secretly the plan all along, because his death wiped out the sins of the world. His friends wrote down what happened in a book and started a new religion. But then the Romans started persecuting them, until one day the Romans changed their minds and decided to become Christians instead. At the end of the world, Jesus will return to judge the living and the dead.
To be honest, when I was a little kid, the story didn't make a lot of sense to me. I remember thinking, so this dude has magical powers and he's invisible and watching me when I sleep at night? It all seemed a little bit creepy. But as an adult, I started learning more about the history of early Christianity. As I read the Bible more carefully and read the works of modern New Testament scholars and ancient historians, I started to realize that the Sunday school version of the Jesus story was vastly different to the story as it appears in the Bible. The actual story is far more complicated and far more interesting. So I thought I'd go out and interview a range of world-renowned biblical scholars and historians and academics and ask them to help me tell the story of how Christianity went from being some sort of fringe Jewish personality cult from the backwaters of the Roman Empire to a point where it was the state religion of that empire wielding enormous power over the emperors themselves. So let's get back to the Sunday school version of the story. What do scholars think about how accurate that version is?
Research that was happening at the beginning of the 20th century, a German scholar, Walter Bauer, came to the conclusion that in fact that picture is a very manufactured one.
And it's not like Jesus was walking around Palestine saying, "Hi, I'm God. I'm going to die for your sins soon. But until then, how about I tell you a few good cracking Sunday school stories, and then afterwards you can get down with worshipping me." That may be the basic view, but that's not quite what happened.
So how did it happen? How did that version become the story most of my Christian friends seem to believe?
A lot of Christians don't actually read the Bible, and if they do read the Bible, they don't read it historically. They don't read it thinking about what the story is telling you about the origins of Christianity.
They look at this uplifting passage or that uplifting passage,
They don't compare the Gospels to one another. They don't look at the really weird stuff. So they feel like they know the Bible, but it's a very selective knowledge. It's a sort of greatest hits or, the most uplifting, most, seemingly relevant stuff to the 21st century.
They're looking for a single verse that will inspire them for their journey that day. And that's perfectly fine, there's no criticism of that. But the problem with that approach is that you're not actually reading the Bible as it's intended to be read.
Christians read bits, but do they read it systematically? Well, systematically, but not necessarily for historical reasons, systematically to clarify their beliefs.
And they just sort of don't get to see all the really strange stuff, all the contradictions, all the discrepancies.
I mean, how do you go from being a religion that celebrates somebody who has died on a Roman cross to a religion that celebrates that cross and takes that cross forward into battle? I mean, that's the story of Christianity within 300 years, going from a superstition to being the state religion. That's absolutely extraordinary. And that is what the early Roman historians called it. They called it a superstition.
But before we get into the story of Jesus, I think we need to wind the clock back a little bit and talk about the world into which Christianity was born. A long time ago, there was a man known as Lord, Liberator, Redeemer, Saviour, simultaneously fully human and fully divine, the Son of God and God, the bringer of peace and salvation, sent into the world in the form of a man to forgive the sins of the people. That's Augustus Caesar. If you ask most people living in the Roman Empire, around about the time Jesus was born, who the Son of God was, most of them would have told you it was this guy. Augustus was the adopted son of the original JC, Julius Caesar, the great Roman general who was stabbed to death in 44 BCE. After he was assassinated, the Roman Senate declared that he ascended into the heavens to become a god. And Augustus, as his adopted son, was therefore called
Deus Filius, the son of the deified. It was new to Rome because it was Augustus himself who saw what he thought was the soul of or a part of Caesar, going up to the heavens, and that's why he can then claim that he is the son, the adopted son, not the natural son, clearly, the son of a divinity.
Another title bestowed upon Augustus was Saviour, because he ended 100 years of civil war.
He brought peace. He brought peace to Rome. He brought peace to the empire.
And then, according to tradition, somewhere around the middle of the reign of Augustus, Jesus was born. So several decades before Jesus even appears on the scene, Romans are pretty familiar with the idea that somebody can die and become a god, or be the son of a god and the saviour of mankind. So who exactly was Jesus? Well, it kind of depends on who you ask. Some scholars believe he was an apocalyptic preacher or a political troublemaker. Others think he was more of a wise sage or a hippie pacifist who preached love and brotherhood. It's a little bit strange that after 2,000 years, scholars still can't agree on exactly who Jesus was. One thing they all do agree on, though, Jesus was a Jew. If you look at pictures of Jesus in most churches today, you'll see a white guy with long brown hair, neatly trimmed beard, blue eyes. But Christianity started out as a Jewish personality cult. Jesus was a Jew, so he probably would have looked more like, DJ Khaled than Jared Leto. He would have been a dark-skinned, brown-eyed Palestinian. Let's put it this way. If Jesus returned and tried to board a plane in the United States today, he'd probably get taken into a little room and randomly screened. And when I say Jesus was a Jew, I don't just mean ethnically a Jew, I mean a religious Jew. In fact, he was a very religious Jew, and so were most of the early members of his sect.
Jesus is Torah observant, Peter is Torah observant, James is Torah observant, and Paul is Torah observant.
The Torah is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament.
Jesus and the guys who ran his group after he died, Peter, the guy he left in charge, and James, who according to tradition was one of Jesus's brothers, were Jews, not Christians. And they weren't trying to start a new religion. They weren't trying to reject Judaism, they were just trying to fix it.
Jesus was not only Torah observant, he actually made the law stricter rather than looser. The law says don't commit adultery. Jesus says don't think about it. That's harder. The law says don't murder. Jesus says don't be angry.
Jesus was a 1st century AD Galilean Jewish prophet. He was a prophet who believed that God was about to intervene decisively in human history.
And being a religious Jew in the 1st century must have been pretty depressing. For hundreds of years, Jewish prophets had promised that their God, Yahweh, really thought they were pretty special. They were his favourite tribe. He had their back, and he was going to make sure they ruled the world. But for some reason, Yahweh hadn't delivered. Century after century, the Jews had been invaded and conquered. In fact, just a few years after Jesus was born, his homeland had finally become an official Roman province.
Jewish people could see that things were not going particularly well, things were not flourishing. They were subject to external powers, whether they be the Greek kings, the Seleucid kings, or whether it be the Romans later on.
Instead of coming to the conclusion that their prophets were wrong, or that Yahweh had lied to them, the Jews just decided they must have disappointed him and he was ignoring them or not answering their prayers. So anyway, the Jews decided they had to be better and make Yahweh happy with them again. But how?
The most important thing to know is that there was no agreed standard of what being a good Jew was in the 1st century.
Just like there are hundreds of different versions of Christianity today, and they all think that they're the right one. We know that in the 1st century there were lots of different versions of Judaism as well, and they were all trying to figure out the magic trick to get them back into Yahweh's good book.
This is a situation that is eventually going to be rectified by God. Destroy the Roman oppressors, think end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, for instance, where the fire comes down and burns up all the Nazis. That's probably the view that a decent number of Jews had.
Now, some Jews living in the 1st century believed that God was going to send someone to save them. They called that person the Messiah.
So how do you know who's a Messiah? Different people will give you different answers, and there are different messianic candidates to follow.
I'm just looking for the official guide to knowing who the chosen one is. I'm sure it's got to be in here somewhere.
There's no messianic checklist in Judaism, as if make sure your mother is a virgin when you're conceived, walk on water, raise the dead, die a sacrificial death, come back after 3 days and ascend. Some Jews were expecting a shepherd, others were expecting the angel Michael, still others were expecting a priest, and still others a warrior. Some people thought John the Baptist was the Messiah, and he doesn't fit any of those categories.
We use the term Messiah, and the term Messiah is fine. It means anointed. It means that God has anointed this person with oil. But when you're talking about Messiah, you're really talking about somebody who is a king in the line of the greatest of all the Jewish kings, King David. And lots of Jews believed that a King David-like figure would establish himself in Jerusalem, and he would transform Israel.
Restore the kingdom politically was part of that. Bring the people back from exile. Set up the homeland again, restore their independence, drive out the foreign invader.
Some Jews thought the Messiah was going to be a great warrior to lead them to a military victory. Others thought he might be a charismatic preacher who would convince the entire world to believe in Yahweh. Others, they didn't think about the Messiah much at all.
Not all Jews wanted a Messiah. Because normally if someone's going around calling themselves a Messiah, it's going to lead to war. War means death, famine, bloodshed, that type of thing. So, I mean, not everyone wanted a Messiah. Not everyone even believed in one.
So there's a variety of expectations. Certainly the dominant one is this political, military figure.
So why is this important? Well, when Jesus is dragged before the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, the charges laid against him are that he's claiming to be the Christos, the Christ, which is just the Greek word for Messiah. In other words, he's claiming to be the King of the Jews.
Mark 15:2. Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the King of the Jews?"
Judea at the time was ruled by Rome. They didn't have a king of their own. They had a governor who reported to the Roman Emperor Tiberius Caesar. Claiming to be the Messiah was an act of political rebellion against Rome. A modern equivalent would be declaring you're the rightful king of the United States. Now, an important thing to understand about the Jewish concept of a Messiah was that he wasn't supposed to be divine and he wasn't going to have magical powers. He was just going to be a regular man.
They did sometimes talk about the Messiah as the Son of God, but not in the later Christian sense. They meant Son of God in the sense of good Israelite, because all Israelites are sons of God in the adopted sense.
Anointed by God, special to God, but like their kings, David, Solomon, and their other good kings, yeah, fully human.
Somebody that God has placed on the throne to rule in his stead. But it doesn't really mean somebody who has from all time been sitting at the right hand of God the Father. It's a different concept from that. It's much more Jewish and it's much more grounded than that.
The Son of God would only have been used, I think, in a metaphorical sense, not in the way that we come to expect with Christian doctrine.
The early Christians took that and ran with it further.
It really does remind me of how Augustus Caesar was anointed to be the adopted son of his father, Julius Caesar, and therefore became the Son of God. You know, here's an interesting thing about Jesus' name. In Hebrew, his name was Yeshua, which basically translates as God saves or Saviour. And as we've already seen, Christ means Messiah, and the Messiah was supposed to be the Saviour. So Jesus the Christ translates as Saviour the Saviour. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, there were actually quite a few guys who people thought might be the Messiah walking around Judea roughly around about the same time as Jesus. None of them succeeded. They all failed. They were all killed. And can you really be the Messiah if you don't achieve anything?
Which is why the vast majority of Jews in the middle of the first century don't follow Jesus.
Because a Messiah was not supposed to die on a cross executed by the Romans. Because this is somebody who's supposed to lead a successful military victory, if you just get executed as a revolutionary, in the eyes of most Jews, that rules you out.
Can't possibly be the Messiah.
Can't be the Messiah in that precise understanding. So what they reinterpret, they reinvent the meaning of the word.
A crucified Messiah was kind of like fried ice cream. It's an oxymoron, it's a paradox. And the Messiah doesn't get crucified. He rises up, defeats the Romans, and establishes a new Davidic kingdom.
What is that? So you want to be a Messiah?
Well, the Messiah, actually.
Oh, okay. Did you kick the Romans out of Judea?
Well, no, not yet, but I try.
Have you converted the world to Judaism?
Well, no, I'm planning on it, but you know, it's...
Did you bring about world peace in your lifetime?
Well, not yet, no, but...
Boy, bye. You really don't have the qualifications to be the Messiah, now do you? Maybe you should try carpentry. I see you have some experience in that area. Next.
So someone came up with the idea to pitch the concept of the Messiah to the Gentiles.
Wait, I've got an idea. What if we market it to Gentiles?
So what you see in early Christian writings is a sort of redefinition of a Messiah
which is a pretty wacky idea when you think about it, because the whole point of the Messiah was he was supposed to save the Jews from the Gentiles, not save the Gentiles.
A Gentile is someone who isn't Jewish.
But of course, the Gentiles didn't know that. They didn't know that the Messiah was supposed to come and defeat them. And they had already been indoctrinated over the last 100 years with the idea that a man could die and become a god, so why not this Jesus guy? The Greeks and Romans already accepted a whole pantheon of gods, so there was no big deal about adding one more, especially if this one is promising that the end of the world is coming soon and that people who pray to him as a god will get the reward of eternal paradise. Something the older gods didn't promise. And who was the number one salesman for this new kind of Messiah?
The earliest references to Jesus come from the letters of the Apostle Paul.
The New Testament contains 14 letters supposedly written by Paul, but many scholars only believe 7 of those are authentic. Despite his letters being stuffed down the back of the New Testament, Paul is actually the first person who ever wrote anything about Jesus, at least as far as we know. But Paul was a bit like that friend you have who just started watching Breaking Bad. He was a bit late to the party.
Paul never met Jesus, but he knew people who knew him.
One of the things that really surprised me when I started studying Christianity was that the earliest and most prolific writer about Jesus never even knew him, never even saw him for that matter. Now, Paul says that he knew people who said they knew Jesus, but did he really know them? We've only got his word for it. And before he joined the Jesus bus, Paul was a hater.
Paul actually had letters from the high priest that enabled him to go and persecute early Christians.
The high priest was a member of the Sadducee sect of Judaism. They controlled the sacrifices in the temple and didn't believe in the afterlife or the resurrection of the dead. But Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison.
In his own words, Paul says he was beating up and arresting Christians because...
Paul says that to him, as a Jew, the idea of a crucified Messiah, the Messiah going and getting crucified, was nonsense.
A few years after Jesus dies, Paul goes from beating them up to becoming their number one salesperson. Why the change of heart? Well, according to his own letters, written in the late 40s CE, about 15 to 20 years after Jesus died, the ghost of Jesus appeared to Paul and told him to go preach to the Gentiles. But how do you convince a bunch of Greeks and Romans to worship a dead Jew? Well, Paul came up with 4 fantastic marketing ideas that continue to resonate with billions of people around the world to this very day.
For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures.
For Paul, the Messiah is not really a warrior king or a charismatic preacher. He's more of a human sacrifice to Yahweh. See, Paul seems to think that Jesus had to die so Yahweh would forgive the human race for Adam having eaten a magical piece of fruit. Oh, merci, madame. Now, most Romans, and in fact most people on the planet, had never even heard of Yahweh, let alone Adam's act of grand theft fruito. So it seems a little bit harsh to sentence them to an eternity of damnation. Now, listen, I know most Christians don't like thinking of Jesus as a human sacrifice to an angry God, but let's be honest, at least on paper, that's exactly what it looks like. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, human sacrifice is the offering of the life of a human being to a deity. Centuries before Paul, both the Jews and the Romans had replaced human sacrifices with animal sacrifices. But he's bringing it back, baby, with the greatest sacrifice of them all.
Not just a human, but a son of a god, the best sacrifice you can possibly have. is this superhuman sacrifice. And because it was given, that blood can save everybody.
And Paul doesn't stop there. He's resurrecting more old ideas.
It comes then down to the fundamental thing for Christianity is Jesus is raised from the dead. That becomes the one thing that makes everything else pale into insignificance. Okay, he hasn't driven the Romans out of Jerusalem, but God raised him from the dead. No matter what else happens, whatever failure he was in his life, he is approved by God.
Like human sacrifice, the idea of a resurrected God wasn't original to Paul or Christianity. Now, like every great marketer, Paul knows how to take a negative, the fact that Jesus didn't really kick the Romans out of Judea before he died, and spin it into a positive. He says, wait, you don't understand. He's going to come back and then he's going to destroy every authority and power. He's like the Terminator. I'll be back. You know what's cooler than a warrior king messiah? A warrior king messiah with superpowers. But not many Jews bought into the whole superpowered messiah idea. They tended to call BS on all of that. So Paul decides he needs to find a new audience. Paul's the guy that takes it to the Gentiles.
The original sect just wasn't hitting the right market, essentially, and Paul figured this out, consciously or unconsciously, and retooled it to be successful in that market, and that's why it exploded, which I think led to the doom of the original sect, because Paul had a much bigger market to tap, so way more Gentiles than Jews, way more Gentiles who were excited by this idea than Jews would be, and so you had the churches explode in size with Gentiles.
Now, of course, in order to market Judaism to the Gentiles, Paul needed to make some pretty fundamental changes. As far as all of the other early Jesus worshippers were concerned, in order to join their little club, you had to either be or become a Jew. But of course, probably the biggest hurdle for most Gentiles in becoming a Jew was that you had to get circumcised, whether you were a child or an adult. But Paulie Walnut says, oh, forget about it.
Just the marketing genius it took to get rid of that one restriction. Oh, we don't have to do that? Sure, I'll become a Jew. Yeah, that's fine. I'll take on this new religion. We don't have to chop our penis up anymore.
Psst. Can I interest you in a new form of Judaism? No thanks. Heard it all before. What if I told you that you don't have to chop off the end of your knob? Go on.
Paul's type of preaching was ideal for them. Oh, we can be in that Jewish trajectory, but without all the stuff we don't like. Sign me up.
But what did the original disciples think about all of this? Well, as they were Torah-observant Jews, we can only imagine. So, Paul, we've been hearing rumors that you've been making up some fakakta stories about Jesus. What exactly are you telling people? Just the usual stuff, James. Jesus was a real mensch who died for our sins. He's coming back any day now with superpowers, yada yada yada. Oh, and Gentiles don't need to become Jews anymore. Whoa, are you crazy? This is a Jews-only club, Babala. Anyone who wants to get in needs to lose the end of his schwanz. Non-negotiable, you schmuck. Peter, Bobby, the Gentiles really like their foreskin. Let them keep it. Oy vey, the chutzpah on this schmendrick. Listen up, Butts. You know Bupkis. We were his best friends. James is his brother. If he wanted to let the goyim in, he would have told us. Listen, I'll tell you what. You do your thing, and I'll do my thing. And we'll just see who wins. Mazel tov.
I think a lot of Jesus' original disciples were very suspicious of Paul. He wasn't part of the original band, he didn't know Jesus, and even worse than that, the young Paul had persecuted the church. He was trying to bring down the church, so why should they trust this guy?
Paul doesn't really seem to care what Peter and James think anyway. He says that when he did meet them, they didn't tell him anything that he didn't already know.
He is very clear repeatedly in his letters that he learned his gospel from no man no human source whatsoever.
I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ.
When he does mention his sources, it's the divine. It's the Lord, it's God, and it's the scriptures also.
Because he feels, well, I've got every bit as much of a right to be called an apostle as you all have. But they said, yeah, but you didn't meet Jesus. So his big answer to that is to say, I did meet Jesus. I met him on the road to Damascus. I met the resurrected Jesus.
Paul says that the ghost of Jesus told him he could throw out 1,000 years of Jewish law and tradition. But they don't seem to believe him. I mean, anyone can claim to have a revelation. And he doesn't really have a great reputation either. I mean, it was only just a few years ago that he was having their friends arrested and beaten up. So they all seem to butt heads.
There's one story where Paul and Peter have a stand-up row in Antioch in front of everybody because they disagree on the implications of the movement that they're part of.
According to Paul's own account, he started calling Peter a fraud to his face in front of everybody.
When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong.
Now, Peter was the first disciple that Jesus ever had. Can you imagine what must have been going through his mind when this Paul guy, who never even knew Jesus, started getting up in his face in front of people? Unfortunately, we only have Paul's side of the story.
When Paul's in a bad mood, and he's in a really bad mood in the epistle to the Galatians, he wants to say, they didn't add anything to me. There's nothing that they told me that added anything to the gospel which I got from God. But we know that this isn't true.
Imagine pacing up and down a room, yelling, while someone's like taking it all down. That's the best way to imagine Paul, creating Galatians, his letter to the Galatians. And at the same time, but a lot of affection and love and care as well. So maybe he was bipolar. I don't know.
And it's not just Peter and James that Paul's having a problem with at this stage. You see, even at this early phase of the Jesus movement, there seem to be a number of different factions emerging. And just like today, they all claim to be the one true movement.
So we have an example of, in 1 Corinthians, Paul is trying to respond to a letter that the Corinthians wrote him saying, hey, this other apostle, Apollos, came by and taught us all this other new weird stuff. It seems to contradict yours. What are we supposed to make of this? But you'd immediately ask, who's this Apollos guy? He's not on any lists of disciples.
Paul calls these other missionaries false apostles, even though he's the guy that never even knew Jesus. Oh, the cojones on this guy! We know that in the first century there were a whole range of divergent Jewish sects, so it seems entirely possible that there were a range of saviour cults running around at the same time as Paul, using similar terminology. Let's just keep in mind that both Jesus and Messiah both mean saviour.
What's the name of your saviour? We just call him the saviour. So Jesus. Yeah, Jesus. What's the name of your saviour? We just call him the saviour. So Jesus? Yeah, Jesus.
Each cult probably would have had their favourite Messiah stories, their favourite miracles and their favourite teachings. Each, of course, would have had their own missionaries as well.
There are manifest signs in the New Testament of big differences. And when you look at other stuff that didn't get into the New Testament, it becomes real obvious.
At one point, Paul gets so angry about these competing missionaries that he writes in his letters he wishes they would cut their own genitals off.
As for those agitators, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. Galatians 5:12.
Emasculate means removal of the penis and the testicles. Not just castration, but the whole package.
So much for turning the other cheek. And remember, this is the same guy that was beating up and arresting Christians just 20 years earlier. Forget about what the disciples would have thought about him for a second. What would Jesus have thought about Paul? As a Torah-observant Jew,
I suspect that he may have found some of Paul's rhetoric a little bit heretical.
I think that if Jesus had said, nobody has to follow the Jewish law anymore, then why would Paul have had such a hard time convincing Jesus' apostles of this?
The Gospels record certain missionary instructions that Jesus gave his followers, but they're not detailed toward going to the Gentiles.
Which, if you ask me, is a little bit of an oversight on Jesus' behalf.
All versions of Christianity today are basically descendants of Paul's version of Christianity. And that was just one sect.
Now, Paul's not going after the well-educated, the Gentiles, or the rich and the famous. Paul's going to take it down market.
It becomes a religion for the poor and the downtrodden and the oppressed and the underprivileged, who can all find in this a sense of a better tomorrow.
The Greco-Roman religions didn't really offer much in the way of an afterlife unless you were some sort of great hero or king. And heaven doesn't actually turn up in Judaism much either. Barely gets a mention in the Old Testament. But Paul is saying you can get eternity in paradise, and he's offering it to everyone. And who doesn't want to spend eternity in paradise? Hell, I'd be happy with a weekend in paradise. So Paul talks a lot about what Jesus is going to do when he comes back. But how much does he have to say about the life and teachings of Jesus during his actual time on earth?
Paul wrote a lot. He wrote a massive chunk of the New Testament, and we don't even get incidental mentions, not even once, about miracles that Jesus did, healings. It's absurd.
Now, one of the explanations for this might be that Paul's letters are really dealing with disputes in his communities about how to be good Christians. But isn't that the perfect time to be quoting the founder of the firm?
When it comes to disputes about that, he could have easily said, Jesus said this. When Jesus was in Jerusalem, he said that. No, what we get is Paul speaking from his own authority. He gets his information directly from the Lord above, from his celestial Christ, and also from the earlier scriptures.
Paul briefly mentions that Jesus was born, died, and resurrected in some form. But that's pretty much it when it comes to talking about the life and teachings of Jesus. There are a few passages where he says he got something from the Lord, but as he claims no human told him anything, he might just be referring to the ghost of Jesus.
To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband. 1 Corinthians 7:10.
But Paul has zero to say about the miracles that Jesus did in his lifetime. There's no turning water into wine, no multiplying loaves and fishes, there's no walking on water, there's no healing the sick with his spit, there's no exorcisms, there's no bringing people back from the dead. Which is kind of strange if you think about it. If you knew somebody who could do all of those things, you'd never stop talking about it.
Whether that's really strange, or whether that's because, for example, he takes for granted that they know that already, is hard to be sure.
Maybe Paul assumed that they already knew the stories. But we have to remember that Paul's writing his letters 20 to 30 years before the Gospels were written. Maybe he'd never heard the stories. Maybe he had heard them but didn't believe them. Maybe they were invented later. Or maybe Paul had heard the stories but just didn't think they were very important. Maybe he thought they were completely irrelevant.
Look at what Christian preachers do today. When they want to say what you should be doing, what you should be thinking, what you should be behaving, what do they say? They say, Jesus says this, Jesus says this, Jesus did this, Jesus taught that. So why doesn't Paul? Why does Paul never say, what would Jesus do?
What did matter to Paul was converting as many people as possible as quickly as possible, because he's absolutely convinced that time is running out.
Paul believes that the end of the world is dawning any minute. I mean, every day he gets up in the morning, he thinks it could be today.
Then we who are alive, who are left, shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. 1 Thessalonians 4:17.
But then time goes on and the end still hasn't arrived yet. So Paul, like every doomsday prophet, Starts to hedge his bets a little.
Suddenly now we've got Christians dying, and that's not supposed to happen. Jesus is meant to return. This kingdom of God is meant to be ushered in, and it's not happening. So there needs to be a rethink.
Well, he says, oh, geez, right, about the resurrection. You see, yeah, some are going to die, but Christ will come back, and the dead in Christ will rise first. We'll be second in line. We'll be transformed.
Paul was clearly wrong. The end didn't come. Paul eventually realizes that he's more likely than not going to die before Jesus returns.
Paul claims the ghost of Jesus told him the end of the world would come within his lifetime. You'd think if God told you the end of the world was happening soon, you'd be pretty careful about getting confirmation. Blessed are the meek. Turn the other cheek. The world will end in your lifetime. Let him who hath not sinned...
Excuse me there, Lord. Could you just repeat that last bit? I'm not sure I heard you correctly. The world's going to end in my lifetime?
Yeah, in your lifetime.
Are you sure?
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Hey, okay, chill, big guy. I just hate to get something like that wrong. Wouldn't want that on my conscience.
So as far as I can tell, one of 5 things must have happened. Either 1, Jesus made a mistake. 2, Jesus lied. 3, Jesus changed his mind and just forgot to tell Paul. 4, Paul misunderstood Jesus. Or 5, Paul just made it all up.
This is a debate among historical Jesus scholars about whether Jesus believed that the end of the world would happen in his lifetime or not. The vast majority of scholars who say, nah, it looks pretty clear from Jesus's teachings as preserved in the Gospels that he really does expect the end to come in his lifetime. So he seems to have been, like many people before him and pretty much everybody after him, everybody who's predicted that the world was going to end in their lifetime thus far has been wrong, and Jesus would seem to have been one of those.
Now, if you don't like to think of Jesus as getting something that important wrong, let's go with Paul made it all up. And if he did...
Maybe he's lying about all this other stuff we're using him for.
Did he really meet Peter and James? We only have his word for it. Did the ghost of Jesus really appear to him and tell him to preach to the Gentiles? So if Paul is throwing out all of this Jewish law and tradition, telling people that the end is nigh, and having public arguments with the original apostles, why did they tolerate him? Well, from how it appears in the Bible, it seems that James and Paul agreed to some kind of payment.
There's a lot of references in letters to him collecting money from his churches. It's clear that some of these churches are challenging him and like, what are you doing with this money? And he has to like justify that, no, don't worry, I'm not running off with it. I'm doing what I said I was going to do with it, which is, he says, taking it back to the saints in Jerusalem, the holy ones in Jerusalem. And we're not entirely sure what that means, but you can be sure it certainly meant that the Jerusalem church, these heads, are getting a cut.
Whether we want to call that a bribe in terms of let's collect this money so that the Jerusalem Christians don't send missionaries to make our lives more difficult, it's hard to say. And Paul's not even sure that, in Romans, he's not even sure that they're going to accept this collection. He says, he expresses anxiety about taking this back to Jerusalem because he thinks, well, maybe they'll reject it. So that sounds a bit like a bribe.
And in fact, he probably gets arrested.
Yeah,
he's in Jerusalem.
I mean, if we follow the book of Acts at that point, what seems to be going on when he is in Jerusalem and is arrested is that that's when he was going to take the collection back and put it at the feet of the apostles in Jerusalem. That doesn't seem to have worked out. Paul went to Rome and was under house arrest there, so presumably Paul got executed by the Romans.
Acts of the Apostles, written many decades later, vaguely blames Paul's arrest in Jerusalem on some Jews who complained that Paul was leading people astray.
Fellow Israelites, help us! This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place.
Of course, the people he's taking the money to in Jerusalem also fit that description. They are Jews who think that Paul is leading people astray with his idolatrous teachings about abandoning the law. Really, in many ways, I think we can say that Paul's the guy that invented Christianity as we know it today. If it wasn't for Paul, I think most Christians today would probably be Jews. Somewhere between the years of 60 and 70 CE, it's assumed that Peter, Paul and James all died. We don't really know much about where or when or how it happened. One thing we do know happened during this period, though, is some Jewish zealots decided to rise up against Roman occupation, and it led to a devastating war. We don't know who started it. Could have been the Judean People's Front, could have been the People's Front of Judea. We know it lasted for 4 years and the Jews got completely destroyed. As it turns out, Yahweh didn't send a Messiah to save them. As punishment for the rebellion, the Romans completely destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. Something else happened just after the destruction of the temple. The first Christian gospel was written.
The earliest of the Gospels is probably the Gospel of Mark, which seems to be written about 70 AD, maybe a few years before, maybe a few years after.
Ironically, the first thing I run into again and again as I travel North America and talk to people who either were Christians or are Christians, and they often tell me, like, the first is like they were shocked to find out that Mark was written before Matthew. They were shocked to find out that the letters of Paul were written before the Gospels.
Here's something that might shock some Christians. Most scholars don't think Mark was written by an eyewitness, or even somebody who knew an eyewitness.
The tradition in the 2nd century is that Mark was written by a disciple of the Apostle Peter, and that he was sort of Peter's secretary who followed him around and took Peter's sermon notes and arranged them into sort of a narrative about Jesus. Is that who Mark really was? It's hard to say.
If Mark had been Peter's scribe, Mark would say, "I'm Peter's scribe." That's how ancient historiography was written.
And despite it being called the Gospel according to Mark, the document doesn't actually state who the author was.
The difficulty with Mark's Gospel is it's like the other Gospels, it's anonymous. We don't really know where it comes from. Most people now think that it's unlikely that Mark is kind of taking down Peter's dictation or anything like that.
But for the sake of simplicity, let's refer to him as Mark. Otherwise, we're going to end up in Prince territory, the author formerly known as Mark. And how's Mark's Gospel connected to the Jewish-Roman war?
Mark is kind of obsessed with the temple, as if something recent and traumatic has happened, so it makes a lot of sense to say that Mark's written after the fall of the temple in AD 70.
The Romans had just come in and destroyed the temple and just ended the cult, basically razed the city of God, destroyed God's temple. So this is a big existential issue. If you're a sect that stems from the Jews and the Jewish God just let heathens come in and destroy his own house, this is a problem. This is a marketing problem, right? It's a PR problem. So how do you explain that? Well, a lot of Mark is structured to answer that and say, like, well, here's the answer.
They've got to reinvent themselves.
According to the Jewish historian Josephus, who actually fought in the war, over 1 million Jews died.
This is a profoundly traumatic time for Judaism. They've lost the land, they've lost the temple, they've lost the sense of God's blessing on their everyday lives. So this is really a very difficult time indeed for Jews.
And of course, the original Jesus gang, the disciples, were Jews living in Jerusalem. So they probably got swept up in all of the death and destruction too. What happened to them, we don't really know. There's no historical record. In fact, we have nothing at all written down by Peter or James or any other eyewitness of Jesus. Nothing. Zero. Nada. Zip. Bupkis. Oh yeah, sure, there are letters in the New Testament that claim to be written by them, but do scholars believe those letters are actually legit?
I don't think we actually have any extant writings from Peter or from James. We have documents that claim to be by them. There are probably other people writing in their honour, in their name, pretending to be these figures. So we are actually a little bit weak on knowing what Peter and James actually thought. We have to reconstruct what they thought.
Like half of the letters attributed to Paul that found their way into the New Testament, many scholars believe the letters from Peter and James are fake. That means we really don't have any clear idea of what Jesus' immediate disciples actually thought about him, his teachings, his miracles, what he told them in private, or what they thought about Paul. They must have been writing letters too, but apparently nobody bothered to keep copies of them.
It's all erased. That data had to have existed. It had to have been written down somewhere in some form. It's just all gone.
Well, how convenient for Team Paul. After the Jewish-Roman War, they're the only major Christian sect that's left. These are the Gentiles, the Greeks and Romans who aren't Jews, don't understand Judaism, and quite frankly don't like the Jews who kind of made fun of their version of the Messiah. So the original disciples, the people who actually knew Jesus and their movement, is pretty much completely wiped out within 40 years of the death of Jesus Christ.
And if we accept that most of the New Testament writing occurs post 70, when the Jews have been removed as an influence, then the kind of Pauline crusade from 20 years earlier is going to win.
So Mark's Gospel is written for a Gentile community, not Jews, and probably in Rome sometime just after the reign of the Emperor Nero. And there's a lot of strange stuff in Mark's Gospel. One of them is that Jesus is walking around trying to tell his disciples to keep their mouths shut about the miracles that he's doing, like it's supposed to be some kind of big secret.
Mark starts out his gospel with saying something that it just blows my mind, and that's in Mark 4:11, where he has Jesus gather all his disciples and say, okay, I'm teaching you all these things in secret, in parables. That way you'll know what I'm talking about. But those outsiders, they won't be able to tell what I'm talking about. Otherwise, and this is the kicker, they would turn from their sins and repent and be saved.
And he told them, the mystery of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside, everything is expressed in parable, so that they may be ever seeing, but never perceiving, and ever hearing, but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven. Mark 4:11.
They can't handle the truth. What kind of Messiah tells his disciples to keep his work a big secret? What kind of Messiah doesn't want his disciples to be forgiven? According to Mark, Jesus is telling secret teachings only to his inner circle.
And when you ask a biblical scholar today, well, what are those secret teachings that he was giving? They don't know any more than we do.
Those secret teachings are lost forever, like the truth about who killed JFK and what happened to Michael Jackson's nose. Maybe the whole secrecy business is Mark's way of explaining why most people in his time had never heard of Jesus?
This is all made up by the author of the Gospel of Mark, as sort of damage control and explanation for why people didn't widely accept him as the Messiah, because he didn't want them to.
So around Mark's time, people are saying, he did all these miracles. I never heard of any guy doing miracles. He goes, well, that's because he told us not to tell anyone.
Right, exactly.
Maybe this story about parables is also a parable?
You go through the gospel story after story after story, and they look like parables that has additional meanings. Like they might not be meant to be taken historically true. And this is how mythology is written, right? You tell a story about something, and it's the meaning of the story rather than the literal truth of the story that's actually the important part of the story.
For instance, let's take a look at the story of the trial of Jesus.
And Mark tells this story where Pontius Pilate wants to let Jesus go, but Mark says that this was the holiday, and on the holiday the Romans would traditionally let go one prisoner, and the crowd kept calling for Barabbas. We want to release Barabbas, whom Mark says was a notorious rebel and murderer, right? And Pilate's like, no, let Jesus go, and not this murderous rebel. And release Barabbas. And so Pilate lets him go, and then Jesus is crucified, and that's the story.
When we look at the depiction of Pilate in non-biblical sources, Pilate is venal. Pilate does not care at all about Jewish sensibilities. Pilate goes out of his way to offend Jews. Pilate is awful. But when we look at the Gospels, going from the earlier Gospel like Mark up to John, Pilate looks better and better and better. I would date Pilate from the Gospels because he seems like a perfectly decent guy who's simply backed into the corner by a bunch of evil Jewish leaders who want him to do away with Jesus.
And now, there's no way this is historically true.
So what does Barabbas translate as?
Son of Rabbas.
The word bar in Aramaic means son of, and Abbas comes from Abba, which means father.
And here's the best bit.
And according to the Gospel of Matthew, Barabbas' first name was Jesus.
Jesus Barabbas.
Jesus, son of the Father.
Pilate says you can have Jesus Barabbas, a murderer and insurrectionist, or you can have Jesus of Nazareth, the other Jesus, son of the Father.
The Jews are given a choice between two Jesuses, two saviours. One is the violent kind of saviour, like the one who tried to overthrow the Romans in the rebellion of 66 CE. The other is a pacifist kind of saviour who's never hurt anything. Which one will the Jews choose to punish?
And what happens? The innocent Jesus pays the penalty, pays the ransom for the very guilty Barabbas, son of the Father. In terms of Christian theology, it's perfect. In terms of history, it's ridiculous.
Two identical saviours. One is going to be set free, one is going to pay the penalty. Now, if you're a Jew living in the first century, this story might sound a little familiar.
Well, we know this story. This is in Leviticus. This is the whole ritual of Yom Kippur, which is the whole atonement ceremony.
Yom Kippur is usually expressed in English as Day of Atonement.
There were two great ceremonies in the Jewish calendar. One was Passover and the other was Yom Kippur. And this one, every year, there would be this, you would have the two goats, the two identical goats. They have to be, look the same. One, you would cast the sins of Israel on and cast it into the crowd, release it into the wilderness. And the other, you would sacrifice on the altar in the temple, and its blood would atone for all the sins of Israel.
The Barabbas story seems to be saying that the goat sacrifices, which had replaced human sacrifices in Judaism, are now being replaced once more with the ultimate human sacrifice. Mark is writing for one of Paul's communities, possibly in Rome.
Originally, it was written to symbolize the gospel. It wasn't written to be taken as literally true, at least not by informed insiders in the sect.
This story, by the way, is where we get the term scapegoat. Forgive me, Lord, I have committed murder.
That's a terrible sin. Have you pushed a goat off a cliff?
Well, yes, Lord, I did.
Well, good then. See you next year.
Now, most people who read the Barabbas story today probably aren't Jews, probably don't know their Leviticus very well. So the whole story about two identical goats goes right over their heads.
And I think you can go from story to story through Mark and see, if you look at it as history, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if you look at it as allegory, as something representing something else, then it makes perfect sense and looks literarily brilliant.
Then, towards the end of Mark's Gospel, we find Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's literally begging Yahweh not to let him be killed.
They went to a place called Gethsemane. He began to be deeply distressed and troubled. He fell to the ground and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. Father, take this cup from me. Mark 14:32-42.
It's a very moving story until you realise that Jesus is Yahweh, so this was his own plan all along, and he's literally begging himself not to kill himself, which is pretty confusing. In Mark, Jesus appears to be very human. He doesn't talk or act like a god in disguise. This might be an idea that Christians came up with later. Speaking of humans and parables, one of the stories that we don't find in Mark is the virgin birth.
Mark starts his gospel and says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then he doesn't tell us a story about Jesus' birth, but instead narrates Jesus' baptism by John. And if you look carefully at this story, with the Holy Spirit descending upon Jesus like a dove and God saying, "This is my beloved Son," it sort of sounds like Mark is saying that this is when Jesus becomes the Son of God at his baptism.
In ancient Rome, birds landing on things was read as a positive sign from the gods. The process of deciphering the movement of the birds was called taking the auspices, which literally translates as looking at birds. It's the basis, by the way, of the English word auspicious. Now, the person who took the auspices was known as an augur, which is the basis of the name Augustus, the original son of God. So again, many people living in the Roman Empire 1900 years ago, reading Mark, would probably have understood the symbolism.
So what you see in early Christian history is that the status of Jesus as Son of God keeps getting kicked back farther and farther. First it's at the resurrection, then it's at his baptism, then it's at his birth, then he's always been there from the beginning of time.
So it evolved. The idea
Absolutely.
of Jesus evolved over a century or so.
Yes, definitely.
And that's just for Paul's communities. The other factions, including the one of the original disciples, had different ideas altogether. In fact, as we'll see a little bit later on, at least one major early Christian faction didn't even believe Jesus was divine at all. One of the other surprising things that's missing from Mark's gospel is one of the most important ideas in all of Christianity: Jesus' resurrection appearances to his followers.
It's so odd. The oldest gospel is Mark's gospel. Most scholars believe that. I believe that. And there are no appearances of the risen Jesus to his disciples. In fact, the gospel ends in a very dark and quite mysterious, enigmatic way, where this young man who just happens to be at the tomb says to the women, go and tell the disciples and Peter what's happened to these women. And the women just run away and don't tell anyone, for they're afraid. That's it. So, I mean, if you believe Mark's gospel, no one ever found out about the resurrection because they didn't tell anybody.
Including Mark, who couldn't have written it down because they didn't tell anyone.
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
At some point, a Christian scribe decided to write a new ending to Mark's gospel. He decided to sex it up a little bit. He retconned it, like George Lucas making Greedo shoot first. I have to wonder, why bother? Why not just leave the original ending as it was?
What's happening, I think, is that the secret doctrines, some of the secret teachings are leaking out into the public teachings.
The first rule about Jesus Club is you don't talk about Jesus Club.
These particular doctrines became less important to keep secret, and so you see them leaking out over time. So you get, the nativity idea, or you get the magical incarnation idea. More of the secrets are being leaked out, and more attempt to try and prove points by creating stories that support your points. And so you get more miracle stories, you get more doctrinally relevant stuff.
It really makes me wonder about the intentions of these early Christians. If the truth was so important to them, why bother rewriting the ending of the first gospel? And just like Paul, Mark is counting down.
Mark's gospel believes, just like Paul does, that the end is absolutely imminent. So there is a line in Mark's gospel, some of those standing here, Jesus says, will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God come with power. It's one of these interesting ironies of history that every time there's a delay in the eschaton coming, the faithful don't kind of give up on the idea. They become all the more eager in thinking that it's about to happen.
The eschaton means the end times, the end of the world as we know it.
Like a modern UFO cult.
Yep.
So
modern religious cults as well. I mean, they do this all the time. When disappointment comes, they don't say, oh, we must have been wrong. Or at least they don't say we must have been wrong in our fundamental identity. They just, we may have got the timetable a bit wrong. So you revise it, you change it. And the early Christians were no different from that.
Those Christians who believe that the Bible is literally true must have a hard time explaining why the world hasn't ended yet.
It's one of the things that I think many Christians across the centuries have really struggled with. The fact that Jesus appears to say that he is coming back within the lifetime of his followers. And that clearly didn't happen. It clearly didn't happen. You can spiritualize it. You can kind of try and find some sort of fine, fancy way of saying in a very real sense, spiritually he did come. But the fact is that he didn't return in the lifetime of his followers. as he had said that he would. And this is something that has always been at the heart of some real anxiety in Christianity. It's almost like a kind of a trauma, trying to come to terms with how can it be that Jesus said this when it didn't actually happen?
Yeah, definitely you can see a trajectory in the New Testament writings as you move from letters like Paul's, so the earliest writings we have, to writings composed in the first half of the 2nd century, where the apocalyptic expectations just continue to get sort of toned down, and there becomes sort of an increasing recognition that Jesus is not coming back anytime soon.
Each generation of Christians was probably led to believe that it would happen in their time, just like still happens, and they may not even have noticed that there had been a delay. It's not like most people had copies of the Bible to read, so they only knew what they heard in church.
Don't worry though, the end of the world is coming any day now.
The next gospel to be written was Matthew, probably 10 or 20 years after Mark, around 80 or 90 CE. So, who was he?
Gospel of Matthew is attributed to Matthew, one of the 12 disciples, but it's improbable that this was actually written by an eyewitness, because Matthew's gospel is using as one of its major sources Mark. And if Mark is not written by a disciple even, why would a disciple, an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry, use somebody else's secondhand reports? Why wouldn't they just tell their own story? So it does not seem that Matthew is actually written by an eyewitness.
And also Matthew, again, is writing in Greek.
Matthew is written, I think, by a Jewish Christian who he kind of likes Mark's gospel. He copies whole passages verbatim, so he clearly quite likes Mark's gospel. But I think he thinks Mark got some things wrong.
For Mark, who's firmly in Paul's world of Christian Gentiles, Jesus doesn't appear to be very Jewish. Matthew, on the other hand, calls BS and all of that. In Matthew, Jesus is quite clear that he's only interested in the Jews.
I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Matthew 15:24-26. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. Matthew 10:5-6.
Which makes Paul's claims that the ghost of Jesus told him to go and preach to the Gentiles pretty suspect. I mean, if that was Jesus' original intention, you think he would have told his apostles.
So Matthew was engaged in this fascinating project of re-Judaizing Jesus. And quite interestingly, because Jesus was a Jew and because he was probably quite faithful to the law, Matthew in a way is also re-Jesusizing Mark's gospel. He's actually bringing it a bit back around to what Jesus was probably more like, the historical Jesus, that is.
A Jew?
Yeah.
Preaching to Jews about being a good Jew.
Right.
It is an irony of history that the most popular gospel in Christian history, far and away, has been the Gospel of Matthew. And yet it presents the most Jewish, of the four gospels, and probably would have been quite hostile to the kind of law-free Christianity that Paul is proposing. These two sources, Paul and the Gospel of Matthew, would definitely come into conflict over whether Gentile Christians should follow the law. Paul definitely says no, they don't. Matthew says yes, absolutely, they do.
And it's one of the amazing things about Christianity is that most people just ignore that. Most people just ignore it. But it was a very important strand in early Christianity, in emerging Christianity, that saw the Christian's duty as being not just to be loyal to Jesus, but also to be loyal to the Jewish law. And they were loyal to the law because they believed that's what Jesus had taught them to do.
So Matthew's position is, if you're not going to temple, you're not circumcised, and you're not eating kosher food, you're doing Jesus wrong?
That's right. They have to get, well, at the very least, they have to get a copy of the Talmud and start learning Hebrew.
Wear a yarmulke.
Yeah.
The Matthew Gospel is where some of those most famous and dubious Jesus stories first turn up. Remember how in Paul's day there seemed to be lots of factions telling different stories about Jesus? Matthew seems to have included stories he had heard that Mark either hadn't heard or just didn't like. Stories like the Sermon on the Mount, the resurrection appearances, and the massacre of the innocents, where Herod the Great, king of Judea, orders the execution of all male babies around Bethlehem. Historians, by the way, have found no other evidence of that ever happening. Matthew probably just made it up to sound like the similar story about Moses in the Old Testament. Matthew is also the first person to mention the virgin birth.
So fully half a century appears before we ever get anyone writing about a virgin birth.
The story of the virgin birth, I think, is baffling. You have in Matthew's Gospel this genealogy that connects Jesus right back to Abraham, going through David.
King David, the possibly mythical second king of the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah, who supposedly killed a giant with a slingshot.
All going through Joseph, Jesus' father. Then the very next story is about how Joseph isn't Jesus' father. I mean, religious people are very good at getting their head around contradictions, but there's a big one right there on the very first page of the New Testament. It's fascinating. What did Matthew think he was doing? Why is he telling a story about a virginal conception when he also wants to tell us that Jesus was descended from David via his father? I don't know. I think it's a mystery.
Did he just hope no one would notice?
And so Jesus is the descendant of King David because Joseph is his father? But I thought Mary was a virgin.
Yeah, look over there. It's the Messiah.
Where?
Oh, no, it's just Larry. They got the same beard.
Oh, no, I lost my place.
Hey, don't worry about it. Let's go get a kosher kebab.
And the fact is, lots of people don't notice. Many Christians will happily affirm Jesus is the son of David. They will also affirm that Jesus was conceived by a virgin.
Scholars believe that Matthew's idea of a virgin birth is possibly based on a bad translation of the Old Testament. See, in the Hebrew version of the prophet Isaiah, he predicts that a baby boy will be born as a sign that God is going to destroy his enemies. And the Hebrew word that Isaiah uses to describe the mother of the boy is Alma. Now, Alma just translates as a childless young woman, but Matthew wasn't using the Hebrew version of Isaiah. He was using a Greek translation, which mistranslated Alma into virgin. Another unfortunate thing about Matthew's Gospel is, despite it being fairly pro-Torah, it's also inspired 1900 years of anti-Semitism.
In Matthew's Gospel, you have this ideal of a kind of loyalty to Torah, loyalty to the synagogue, to all of these Jewish traditions, and yet also this bitter vitriol against fellow Jews.
Now keep in mind that although Matthew is a Jew and he's writing for a community of Jewish Christians, they're an extremely fringe sect, kind of like the way that Catholics view Mormons today. And he's writing 10 or 20 years after this big Jewish-Roman war, so Jews are probably pretty unpopular across the empire. And the Jesus Jews want to distance themselves from the traditional Jews as much as possible for political reasons. And Matthew, just like Mark and Paul before him, believes that the end of the world is going to happen very soon. But keep in mind, by the time he's writing, most of those original disciples are probably dead, and yet there's still no sign of Jesus.
According to most scholars, the next gospel to be written is Luke, written somewhere between 10 and 30 years after Matthew. Luke, by the way, also wrote the Acts of the Apostles, which is kind of a sequel to the Gospels.
Luke's writing, I think, this really big epic narrative. He wants to tell the story of Jesus and the story of the early church. Luke, according to tradition, was a traveling companion of Paul. He was a Gentile, a physician, a doctor in the ancient world, So he was definitely a what we would call a second generation Christian.
He says, this is the stuff that was handed on to us and written down by earlier generations, and I'm, working with it myself.
In reality, we know he's not using oral lore. We know he's using the previous books, Mark and Matthew. So yeah, so the traditional attributions are clearly late legend, and mainstream scholarship has long since realized that and gotten off that wagon.
Acts of the Apostles, Luke's account of what happened after Jesus died, tries to whitewash all of this tension and conflict that obviously existed between Paul and the original Jesus gang.
Luke undoubtedly is trying to present an idealized account of the early Christian community. Certainly at the end of Acts chapter 2, you've got everyone gathered around, the apostles teaching, breaking bread, worshipping God, finding favor of God and all the people. So it's definitely an idealized account.
All of the anger, tension and bribery that we see in Paul's letters either disappears in Luke or gets toned down. It's kind of like he's saying, oh, it was nowhere near as bad as you've probably heard.
So I think he does try to paint generally a rosy picture of it, but it's certainly not a complete whitewash. He does include some instances of division and differences, and I mean, he does portray Paul as quite a hothead.
By the time Luke's writing Acts towards the end of the first century, the Pauline community are trying to strengthen their credentials, trying to solidify their connection to the original founders, Peter and James, who are probably dead at this stage. Their community is pretty much wiped out, and so they can't fight back. Winners get to write the history. All in all, Luke's not a very credible historical source. And Luke, just like Matthew, Mark and Paul before him, believes the end of the world is going to happen anytime soon.
Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things are fulfilled. Luke 21:32.
The last of the four Gospels to be written is John, probably written around 100 or 110 CE. Compared to the other three,
John is different. Think of it this way, the Synoptic Gospels.
The Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke are called synoptic, which means they share a common vision of Jesus.
New York, LA, Chicago. John is basically New Orleans, okay? He's doing something very different down there.
With John, this whole thing is so obviously a literary creation. Jesus in the Gospel of John does not sound like he does in the other Gospels, and all the characters in John sound the same way, like you're watching a Woody Allen movie. Everybody's talking like Woody Allen in it because he wrote everybody's part. And so it's obvious this is not anybody's recollection.
Instead of telling everyone to keep the stories about his miracles a big secret,
He might as well have on a t-shirt, "I am God," written in big letters. And you have to wonder, well, didn't they have blasphemy laws then? Why wasn't he stoned to death 5 minutes out of the gate?
The woman saith unto him, I know that Messiah cometh, he that is called Christ. When he is come, he will declare unto us all things. Jesus saith unto her, I that speak unto thee am he. John 4:25. I and my Father are one. John 10:30.
John's Gospel contains no parables, no Last Supper, no Sermon on the Mount. But it's the only one with Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And it's the most anti-Semitic of the Gospels.
as for the second coming, as far as John's concerned, it's happening right now. Why is John so different from the other three Gospels? No one really knows. But if we look at Paul and the four Gospels in chronological order, we can kind of see how the Jesus story evolved over time. In Paul, he doesn't do any miracles and becomes special after he died. In Mark, he becomes special when a bird lands on him, walks around being a secret miracle worker
whose body disappears from a cave. Matthew and Luke make him the product of a divine pregnancy who comes back from the dead. And in John, he's proudly out of the God closet. But if you think the variation in these stories is strange, where do you see the stories that didn't even make it into the Bible?
So one of the things that many Christians don't know is that in addition to the 4 canonical Gospels, there's a number of other early Christian Gospels out there.
Canonical means approved by the Vatican.
In the early centuries, there were some fairly significant Christian factions, the Ebionites, the Marcionites, and the Gnostics, and they all had pretty different ideas about who Jesus was. Their Gospels were all destroyed by imperial decree around 400 CE. However,
one suspects that some monk in Upper Egypt decided, I can't do this to, I've spent my entire life writing them out, for example. I can't do this to that. So I'm going to gather them up and put them away safely and say that they're destroyed, whatever.
But the wonderful thing that happened in 1945 is there was the discovery of 12 codices, 12 ancient leather books found in a jar in Nag Hammadi in Egypt.
Some of them, and the ones that I love the most, are infancy Gospels. So stories about Jesus's birth and childhood. And one of the most interesting of these is a text that is generally known as the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And what this text seeks to do is say, what would Jesus have been like as a child? If he's a divine being, which this text believes him to be, if he's a divine being from the beginning, he's got all this miraculous power, what does a kid like that look like? According to the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, it's not a pretty picture.
It's Jesus the Bart Simpson of the early Christian world. He's really a brat.
One story in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas says that when Jesus was 5 years old, he was sitting by a pool of water making clay sparrows which were coming to life, and when another kid came and messed with his pool of water, Jesus cursed him and he withered up and died.
He's basically a little supervillain.
Yeah, I'd say so, because he essentially gets angry at a number of his playmates for different things and kills them. And so he kills one playmate, he kills another playmate, then the villagers start to complain to Mary and Joseph.
What's Kid Jesus's response to all this? He makes his accusers go blind.
Oh, what the? I can't see. What's going on?
This Ron Burgundy says that escalated rather quickly. So it's a fascinating story, and yet if we think that the story is saying, oh, Jesus had these sort of immature things that he had to work out of his system, I don't think that's what the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is saying. It's essentially saying that's who Jesus is. He's got all the power of God, and if people are jerks to him, he can strike them dead. This is how they viewed Jesus, weird and upsetting to us as it seems to be. And I love Joseph's instructions to Mary after all of this has happened. He takes Jesus, puts him in their house, and tells Mary, don't let him outside because those who annoy him end up dead.
Oh, you might think, well, that's an unbelievable story. No wonder it didn't end up in the Bible. But is it any crazier than stories about walking on water or turning water into wine or raising people from the dead or zapping demons into a herd of pigs? Why do we say these magic stories are crazy, but these other stories about magic, well, they're just fine and dandy?
Back then they were arguing over what Jesus was, who he was. What was his relationship to God? All the controversies about Christology. And this included, of course, whether Jesus was even a human being.
Just a really interesting human being who somehow became possessed by God. Others thought he was an angel. Still others thought he was part of God. Still others thought he was just a good teacher. They didn't know.
One of the really big early Christian factions, the Ebionites, might have closely resembled the original Christians, Team Peter.
The Ebionites, again, that means the poor, they claim to be the descendants of the Jerusalem Christians. Maybe they were.
To be a true Christian, you had to obey the Jewish law. They seem to have denied the idea of the virgin birth, and they had a kind of gospel that sounds very much like a Jewish Christian gospel, maybe one of the earliest forms of the gospel.
We have people who are following Jewish law, honoring the Sabbath on Saturday and keeping it holy, circumcising their kids, and they're worshiping Jesus.
The Ebionites declared Paul a heretic. On the other hand, another one of the major early factions, the Marcionites, loved Paul, but really hated Judaism.
Marcion said that Jesus had come from a different God, not the Hebrew God, not the Creator God, not the Torah-giving God.
The God of the Old Testament. So the God of the Old Testament was a wicked God who made the world. I mean, that's why the world was so messed up.
The Gnostics claimed to have a special teaching from Jesus that only they knew about.
Well, the word Gnostic really means somebody who's claiming to have knowledge.
But it's basically the idea that this world is bad and wicked and we have to get away from it. And getting a certain secret knowledge of the universe's origins and your own cosmic origins is how you get away from it all.
So why didn't all of those Gospels make it into the Bible? Well, a common Christian view is that the ones that made it in were the real stories, and the ones that didn't were just made up.
Well, when it comes to the stories of Jesus' birth and childhood, it's all made up. If you talk to most New Testament scholars about the infancy narratives, the Christmas story in Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel, they'll say, there's not much historical basis behind any of that. There's no census, there's no slaughter of the innocents by Herod, there's no Star of Bethlehem, no wise men. Jesus probably was not born in Bethlehem. He was probably born in Nazareth. Those stories are all propaganda that are designed on the one hand to present Jesus as a divine being from the moment of his birth, and also to say he can fit the qualifications for Messiah because he's born in the city of David.
Of course, all of these factions believe that their version of Christianity was the correct one, just like they all do today.
There are many different Christianities today. There were many different Christianities back then.
Eventually, Team Paul sold their soul to the first Christian emperor, Constantine, who fought his way to power in the year 305 CE. According to his contemporary, Bishop Eusebius, the so-called father of church history, Jesus appeared to Constantine in a vision and said he'd help him defeat his rival for the throne in a bloody war. Hallelujah! Jesus is finally the warrior king Messiah that the Jews had been waiting for. According to Christian sources from the time, Jesus used his supernatural powers to help Constantine kill thousands of Roman citizens and consolidate his control over the empire.
Winners are grinners, and so because the A version of Christianity secures imperial support early in the 4th century, they're able to suppress their opponents ever more effectively.
Once Christianity and Orthodox Christianity became the official religion of the empire, they had official patronage. You then could use imperial power to put the thumbscrews down on any dissident Christian groups.
The final selection of books that made it into the Bible wasn't actually decided upon until 400 CE. It seems like a number of competing Christian factions might have merged into some sort of megachurch.
Each of these gospels has a faction behind it. There's a lot of people they have their own favorite gospel. It's like everybody has their own favorite Harry Potter novel or whatever. And so if you want to win this battle for control of the church, you want as many people on your side to outnumber the other side. And the best way to do that is to pick gospels that had a lot of supporters behind them, that were not too deviant.
The other Gospels were declared fake news.
Constantine does not enforce Christianity on everybody. Constantine allowed pagan temples to stand and pagans to worship, and he let Jews be Jews.
But he does favour just one Christian faction and tries to shut down all the rest. And this one faction has no hesitation at putting the head of the Roman Empire, the same Roman Empire that killed Jesus, Paul, Peter and James, at the head of their church.
And so Constantine, I think he treats Christianity as any emperor has treated any other religious kind of group, by saying, well, I'm the head of religion, I am the Pontifex Maximus, so therefore I'm the head of this community. The bishops seem to agree to that without much hesitation.
Overnight, the persecuted become the persecutors, and the first group that they persecute are other Christians, who they now declare heretics.
You're only a heretic if you lose the historical battle. And it takes the church about 300 to 400 years to figure out who's in and who's out.
About 50 years after Constantine, another Roman emperor, Theodosius, drove the final nail into the cross and made Catholic Christianity the state religion of the empire.
So not only are pre-existing varieties or versions of Christianity wiped out or put on a banned list, new dissident groups emerge and are dealt with this new kind of imperial authority.
Temples were shut down. Pagan priests, if they wanted to keep their job, became Christian priests. Jews had their movements restricted, were not allowed to join certain guilds, had their synagogues burned down. And the empire becomes Christian, and it remains Christian because of the force of the state and the force of the army. Was this a good thing or a bad thing? It was a thing, and it's something we have to deal with.
To put a modern perspective on it, imagine that the Scientologists were able to get Tom Cruise elected president of the world, and he passed a law making Scientology mandatory.
And that's what Team Paul did around about 400 CE. The Roman Empire became a theocracy, not unlike the caliphate that ISIS has been trying to set up in the Middle East in the last few years. It's not that hard to be a successful religion when you're the only game in town and everything else is pretty much outlawed. So that's the story of how Christianity went from being irrelevant to inescapable. But in the words of a different God, wait, there's one more thing.
You know, it wasn't that long ago that most historians believed that the characters in the Old Testament, like Abraham or Moses, or figures from literary history like King Arthur, were also based on real people. But today, most historians think they are completely mythical. So, what about Jesus?
Well, when I started as a historian, and I was actually quite certain that Jesus existed as a historical person, and I thought anyone who suggested otherwise was a crackpot. And what happened was, the more I looked at the evidence, the worse it looked. The more you pull at the threads, the more it falls apart. And I started to realize by the end of it, it was like, actually on balance of evidence, it looks like it goes the other way.
It just seems to me the weight of probability is that there was no Jesus.
One thing that struck me is just the case for this figure is extremely poor. The main sources we have are the Gospels. Over time, we found even more reason to doubt the Gospels. They're just really, really poor sources. They're not what we want.
E.P. Sanders says that Jesus is better attested in history than Alexander the Great. When you actually compare the evidence for both of those figures, that's not even close to correct. And actually, the evidence for Alexander the Great is way better than for Jesus.
Obviously, a lot of evidence gets lost or destroyed over the years, like the letters of Team Peter. So historians are trying to piece together what happened using sketchy evidence or evidence that's been corrupted, like Mark's Gospel.
And the trick to that is that you look at that body of evidence, you got to look at it all. You can't leave anything out, even stuff that's weird, and say, is that the evidence that should exist if this hypothesis existed? Is it what we expect? And that's what you look at, and you can measure that in the sense of your feeling of like, how expected is this evidence, or how weird is this evidence given that hypothesis?
And then you look at all of the theories and try and decide which one does the evidence support best.
And if you're stuck in this situation where the evidence is equally expected on all your hypotheses, then you don't know. It could be any one of those hypotheses, and we just kind of have to settle on, well, it's one of those, we don't know.
So how does the evidence stack up with the theory that Jesus actually existed?
I think on balance, he probably didn't exist. I think the hypothesis that he started out a revelatory being and became historicized later, I think fits the evidence better. It makes the evidence more expected, especially a lot of the weird stuff.
So in other words, Jesus appeared as some kind of an angel in visions to people like Paul. And then later on, people decided that, well, he must have been real. But of course, this kind of a view is still a minority amongst scholars. But will it always be that way?
We saw the same thing with the challenging of the historicity of Moses, right, in the 70s. Everybody said that's fringe, that's crazy. Now it's the mainstream consensus, at least agnosticism, about the historicity of Moses. And that took, 20, 30 years. So, I always tell people, like, come back to me in 20 and 30 years, and then we'll see if that's still the situation or if it's changed since then.
This kind of talk gets some people pretty cranky.
Well, look, my blunt response to that, the whole Jesus mythicism thing, to be frank, I consider it mental masturbation for atheists. That's the best way I can describe it. It's the ultimate get-off, telling your arch enemy that their superhero didn't exist. It's with the joy of going up to some bratty kid you don't like and saying, hey kid, guess what? There's no Santa Claus.
Telling a little kid that Santa doesn't exist might be mean, but it's also true. Look, the fact is that the historical evidence that Jesus existed is pretty slim, to say the least. But the evidence that the stories about him were all over the place and kind of evolved over time is incredibly strong. Make from that what you will. So let's take a look at what our new updated Sunday school story looks like.
Around 2,000 years ago, the Romans decided that dead men could be gods and living men could be sons of gods. Meanwhile, in the backwaters of the Roman Empire, the Jewish people were waiting for their god, Yahweh, to send a warrior king they called the Messiah to kick out the Romans. But the Messiah was a no-show. Eventually, several generations later, a small fringe Jewish sect said, "This is our guy." Jesus Christ, which means Saviour the Saviour, was a very Jewish Jew, but had two problems in his messianic resume. He had not defeated the Romans, and he was already dead. A few years later, Paul, who had been busy beating up early Jesus worshippers, suddenly changed his mind and invented his own version of the Jesus sect. He reinvented the Messiah to be a superpowered celestial warrior king for non-Jews who could keep their foreskin and still get into heaven. The OG Christians weren't impressed. "This is fake news. Paul didn't even know Jesus. This is a Jews-only club, bubbler." According to Paul, Jesus spoke to him in visions, and any day now, JC would come down to earth with supernatural powers to defeat the Romans and anyone else who didn't worship him. Unfortunately, Jesus didn't return within Paul's lifetime, and despite writing lots of letters in his 30 years of missionary work, Paul never mentioned anything about Jesus' life, teachings, or miracles. But the Jews did get their war against the Romans, and got their butts badly kicked. No warrior king Messiah showed up, and their temple was torn down. The original disciples of Jesus were all dead, leaving not a single written record of what they thought about Jesus or his teachings. After the war, one of Paul's community did document some stories about Jesus, in which he appears as a human, but with superpowers and a big secret, who begs Yahweh not to let him be killed, but Yahweh ignored his prayers. Many other versions of the Jesus story were recorded over the next 100 years, none by actual eyewitnesses, or people who knew eyewitnesses, or people who knew people who... you get the idea. As time passed, these stories grew more far-fetched, suddenly including miracles like walking on water, the virgin birth, the resurrection of violent teenage Jesus, and Jesus raising people from the dead. All these authors were still certain that the Messiah would come to defeat their enemies within their lifetimes, but he still didn't come. For 300 years, various Jesus factions fought against the Romans, lions, and amongst themselves about who Jesus was and how to worship him properly, until one of these groups met with the Roman emperor and said, "Give us protection and tax breaks and we'll make you the head of our religion." "That's an offer I can't refuse," said the Emperor Constantine, and within 100 years this group managed to take control of the entire empire. They burnt competing gospels, tore down temples, killed pagan philosophers, and banned other religions, including competing versions of the Jesus Club. And that, my friends, is the slightly more accurate story of the triumph of Christianity. Amen. Well, isn't that a far more interesting story? And it's also one that's supported by historical evidence and biblical scholars. So what does the next century hold for Christianity? Peace and love, or another theocracy? I guess only time's going to tell. Unless, of course, Jesus does come back soon, which I've been told with very good authority should be happening any minute now.
Two eyes are blue. Jesus Christ, he was a Jew. Has anybody seen my Lord? Big hook nose, there he goes, preaching so that everyone knows. Has anybody seen my Lord? Speared in the abdomen by a Roman, blood gushing out, roasting the dead, so it is said. People believe without a doubt Jesus died, still a Jew, so why aren't you? Has anybody seen ma? Has anybody seen ma? Has anybody seen my Lord?